A district attorney bet $1 million that no one could beat him in court until a student shut him up in front of everyone. Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll read today. The marble halls of the Grand City Hall in Washington, D.C. gleamed with the pride itself under the floodlights. Cameras flashed incessantly, while expensive suits moved among whispers and murmurs of anticipation. Reporters swarmed like vultures hungry for news, all with their microphones extended towards the center of that crowd. There, at the heart of that media circus, stood the imposing figure of District Attorney Patrick Harding. His silver temples reflected the light with calculated elegance. His Italian shoes shone like mirrors, and every word that came out of his mouth had been polished to rhetorical perfection. He was a man accustomed to bending the truth until it became victory, a master of legal manipulation who had never known defeat. "I'm betting $1 million, he declared with a smile that oozed pure arrogance, looking directly at the cameras as if he were the absolute owner of American justice. "I bet that no student, no lawyer, no soul in this entire country can beat me in a court. Ever!" Laughter erupted like fireworks. Applause echoed against the marble columns. Some reporters even stood up to applaud, as if they were witnessing the grandest spectacle of their lives. The flashes multiplied, immortalizing that moment of supreme hubris. But across the city, in a forgotten corner where prosperity had never arrived, in a poor neighborhood, hidden behind a steel factory that had been closed for years, a 13-year-old girl named Alex Reyes watched that same press conference on a broken television whose screen was cracked like her grandmother's old glasses. Alex didn't laugh. Her small, thin arms still ached from carrying buckets of water all morning, because the pipes in her house had frozen again overnight. Her blouse had a hole near the sleeve, clumsily mended with thread of a different color, and her sneakers 2 sizes larger than she needed were patched with silver duct tape that shined under the pale light of the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In her hand she held a sandwich she had made with stale bread and a little ketchup, the only food left in that house where the refrigerator made more noise than coal. She watched that man on television speak as if justice were a game designed exclusively for the rich, as if the courts were his personal playground. Alex had never set foot in a courtroom, but she had lived with the constant terror of what those places represented for people like her. Her father was serving a 3-year sentence for stealing a car battery not to cause mischief, but to sell it and buy powdered milk when she was just a baby. Her mother, who had passed away the previous year from an illness they couldn't afford to treat, had once told her in a broken voice, "Don't trust men like that, honey. They don't see girls like you. For them, we're invisible." Those words resonated in her mind every night, especially when hunger woke her up, and she had to invent stories to calm her stomach. Alex had learned to live in the shadows, to walk the school hallways like a ghost, to lower her gaze when the other children made fun of her patched clothes or her lunchbox made from a cardboard box lined with newspaper. When City Hall announced a mock trial contest as a mix of fundraising and publicity stunt, her school decided to participate. The proposal was tempting and terrifying at the same time. A student would face Patrick Harding in a real courtroom, before real judges, in a simulation that would be broadcast on national television. The requirements seemed impossible. They had to prepare a case, study law, understand procedures that not even many adults fully understood. The teachers spoke of the contest as if it were a bad joke, something that only the brightest and most privileged students could even consider. But Alex raised her hand. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Her classmates looked at her as if she had just declared she could fly. The teacher, Mrs. Gonzalez, blinked several times before managing to articulate a response. "Alex, dear, this contest is more intended for high school students," she said with a condescending smile, as if she were explaining to a little girl why she can't touch fire. "These are very complex topics. They require a lot of preparation." "I can read," Alex replied with a simplicity that cut the air like a knife. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every word carried the weight of years of accumulated silence. "And I know what justice should look like." The following weeks were a hell of mockery and humiliation that Alex endured with the same resignation with which she had learned to tolerate the cold, the hunger, and the loneliness. Her classmates made her the perfect target for their adolescent cruelties, finding in her audacity a golden opportunity to exercise the psychological violence they had learned from the adult world. "You don't even have a real backpack," whispered Brenda Martinez, the daughter of the owner of the largest pharmacy in town, pointing to the worn-out satchel that Alex carried, made of burlap and patched with scraps of different colors. "How are you going to face a real lawyer?" "She smells like dampness," added Roberto Sanchez, whose father was an accountant, and who always carried lunchboxes full of food that Alex could only dream of. "She probably lives in one of those houses that flood when it rains." The comments came like constant stabs. In the hallways, at recess during classes. Some children made exaggerated gestures when she passed, covering their noses or pretending to cough. Others simply ignored her, as if she were another piece of furniture in the classroom, something unimportant that occupied space without deserving it. But what hurt the most were the looks of pity from the teachers. Professor Ramirez of history called her after classes one Friday afternoon. "Alex," he said with that gentle voice that adults use when they're about to break a child's heart, "maybe it would be better if you waited until next year. This contest, well, it requires resources that maybe your family doesn't have right now." The girl looked at him intently, her dark eyes shining with a determination that the teacher couldn't interpret. "What kind of resources, Professor?" "Law books, internet access, time to study without worrying about other things." The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding directly mentioning the poverty that surrounded Alex like a second skin. "What? I can get books at the library," she replied calmly, "and I have time at night." The professor sighed. "Alex, this isn't a game. Patrick Harding has won hundreds of cases. He's one of the most respected lawyers in the country. He has teams of investigators, assistants, unlimited resources. But he has to follow the same rules as me, right?" the girl asked, tilting her head slightly. The simplicity of the question left the teacher speechless for a few seconds. "Yes, but then I'm going to participate." That night, Alex walked to the public library, a red brick building that stood like a castle in the center of town. It was Friday afternoon, and most of the children her age were at home watching television or playing video games. She went straight to the law section, where the books seemed as big and threatening as the lawyers who had written them. The librarian, Mrs. Carroll, watched her with curiosity. She was an older woman, with white hair and thick glasses, who had dedicated her life to taking care of those books as if they were her own children. "Can I help you, sweetie?" she asked kindly. "I'm looking for information about trials," Alex replied. "How they work, what the lawyers say, how they convince juries." Mrs. Carroll raised her eyebrows. "Is this for a school project?" Alex hesitated for a moment. "Something like that." The librarian guided her to a table full of books that looked like giant encyclopedias. "These are very advanced for your age. But if you're really interested," she handed her a thinner book. "Start with this one. It's called Introduction to the American Judicial System. It's written so that any citizen can understand it." For the next 2 hours, Alex immersed herself in a completely new world. She learned about the presumption of innocence, about the burden of proof, about the difference between facts and opinions. Each page was like discovering a secret language, a code that the powerful use to maintain their power. When the library closed, Mrs. Carroll approached her table. "Can I ask you why you're so interested in this?" Alex looked up, her eyes tired but bright. "Because I think justice should be for everyone, not just those who can afford it." The older woman felt something stir in her chest, a recognition of something pure and powerful in that little girl. "You can take that book home," she said softly. "But promise me you'll take care of it." "I promise." That night, under the yellow light of a candle, because the power had gone out again, Alex really began her preparation. She didn't have a desk, so she used the floor of her room, spreading her papers on an old blanket. She didn't have a computer, so she wrote her notes by hand in notebooks that she salvaged from the school trash. But she had something that Patrick Harding, with all his resources and his arrogance, had never had: the desperate urgency of someone who has nothing to lose and everything to gain. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continue. The nights became Alex's refuge, the only time of day when the world quieted down enough for her to listen to her own thoughts. After her grandmother fell asleep in front of the old television, after the noises of the street faded, and only the distant murmur of traffic on the main road remained, she lit her candle and opened her books. Her room was small, barely enough for a single bed and a wooden drawer that served as a dresser. The walls were covered with wallpaper that was peeling in the corners, revealing damp stains that formed maps of imaginary countries. The ceiling had a leak that only manifested when it rained hard, but which had left a circular brown stain that Alex had learned to ignore. In that small space, surrounded by borrowed books and blurry photocopies that Mrs. Carroll had gotten for her from university texts, Alex slowly built her arsenal of knowledge. Each night was a small victory against ignorance, against the voices that told her she couldn't, that she shouldn't even try. The legal cases she studied became as familiar as fairy tales, but infinitely more real and more cruel. She read about people who had lost everything for not being able to afford a good lawyer, about families destroyed by unjust sentences, about children like her who had grown up with parents in prison for minor crimes that society punished disproportionately. One night, as she was reading about a 1987 case where a man had been convicted of stealing food for his children, she felt something break inside her chest. The similarity to her father's story was so painful that she had to close the book and breathe deeply several times before she could continue. "Why?" she whispered to the empty air of her room. "Why does it have to be so hard just to survive?" But the question remained unanswered, like so many others that accumulated in her mind. Instead of seeking comfort, Alex took a worn pencil and began to write in the margins of her notebooks. They weren't just legal notes. They were thoughts, observations, connections she made between the cold laws and the warm lives of the people she knew. She wrote about Mrs. Maria, the neighbor who cleaned offices early in the morning to pay for her children's school. About Don Furman, who sold sweets on the subway because his pension wasn't enough for medicines. About her own grandmother, who made tortillas by hand to sell on the corner because her arthritis didn't allow her to do harder jobs. All those stories had something in common. They were people that the legal system didn't see, that didn't matter enough to deserve real justice. They were shadows on the margins of a society that had decided that their suffering was the natural price of the established order. During classes, Alex began to see the world differently. When the civics teacher explained about the separation of powers, she thought about how those powers had never reached her neighborhood. When the history teacher talked about the social struggles of the past, she wondered why those struggles seemed to have been forgotten, just when they were needed most. Her classmates noticed the change. Alex, who had always been quiet, now seemed to be in another world completely. During recess, while others played or chatted, she would sit under the shade of a tree with a book or notebook, taking notes with the concentration of a scientist discovering a new species. "She's acting weirder than before," commented Sophia, a girl with curly hair who always had the most elaborate lunchbox in the class. "Do you think she's really going to do that trial thing?" "My dad says it's ridiculous," replied Carlos, the son of a prosperous mechanic who owned the biggest garage in town. "He says they're going to make fools of themselves on TV, and it'll be embarrassing for the whole school." But Alex no longer listened to those comments. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to filter out the noise and focus on what really mattered. Every mockery, every scornful look, every cruel whisper became fuel for the fire that burned inside her. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult math class, Mrs. Gonzalez stopped her in the hallway. "Alex, I've been talking to the other teachers about your project," she said, using that tone that adults employ when they are going to give bad news disguised as advice. "We're worried about you. Your grades have dropped a little, and we see you very absorbed in this contest." The girl looked at her with eyes that seemed older than her 13 years. "My grades are fine, teacher, and this is important to me. But, dear, you have to be realistic. Patrick Harding is a professional with decades of experience. We don't want you to have false illusions and then—" "Then what?" Alex asked, with a calmness that surprised the teacher. "Then you'll suffer a very big disappointment." Alex smiled for the first time in weeks. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who has understood something that others can't see. "Teacher, I already live disappointed every day. What could be worse than that?" The weeks passed like pages torn from a calendar that no one was keeping track of. Alex had established a routine that revolved completely around her preparation. Classes during the day, where she floated like a ghost among the lessons that no longer seemed relevant to her, and studies at night, where she truly lived. The library had become her second home. Mrs. Carroll had begun to set aside specific books for her, texts that came from other libraries, or that she obtained through contacts she had cultivated during decades of service. Every time Alex arrived, the older woman had a pile of materials waiting for her, like birthday gifts that arrived without a special date. "Today I have something special for you," Mrs. Carroll told her one Tuesday afternoon, as the rain drummed against the library windows. She took a thin book from under the counter, with worn corners and a spine repaired with tape. "It's called When David Faced Goliath: Impossible Cases Won by Truth." Alex took the book with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred relic. The yellowed pages told stories of novice lawyers who had defeated giant corporations, of ordinary people who had changed unjust laws, of moments in history where justice had triumphed against all odds. That night, under the flickering light of her candle, Alex read about a case that would mark her forever. In 1943, an African-American woman named Constance Baker had defended a group of students who had been unjustly expelled from the university. She had no experience, no resources, but she had something that her opponents did not possess. She knew intimately the injustice she was fighting. "It's not about knowing more laws," Baker had said in an interview years later. "It's about understanding more deeply what it means to be human." Those words were embedded in Alex's heart like arrows of light. All this time she had been trying to become something she wasn't, to learn to speak the language of the powerful. But perhaps the secret wasn't in imitating Patrick Harding, but in being completely different from him. The next day, she changed her strategy completely. Instead of memorizing more legal cases, she began to write about her own life. In a notebook that she rescued from the trash, one that someone had discarded after using only half the pages, she began to document her reality with the precision of an anthropologist studying an unknown culture. She wrote about the early mornings when her grandmother would get up at 4 to prepare tamales to sell at the subway station, about the shame she felt when she had to go to the store with a few coins, internally begging that they would be enough for the basics, about the nights when she fell asleep hungry, because she had decided that it was better to save the food for breakfast the next day. But she also wrote about moments of dignity that shone like diamonds in the midst of poverty, about how her grandmother never lowered her head to anyone, always maintaining an upright posture that challenged the world to judge her, about how Mrs. Maria, the neighbor, shared her food, even when she herself had little, about the way the children in her neighborhood took care of each other, creating networks of solidarity that no government program had managed to establish. One afternoon, as she was walking back from the library, she stopped in front of City Hall. It was an imposing building, with columns that rose to the sky like accusing fingers. The marble stairs gleamed even under the cloudy sky, and the bronze doors seemed designed to intimidate rather than invite. Alex slowly climbed the steps, each step resonating like a small earthquake in the silence of the afternoon. Upon reaching the entrance, she put her small hand against the cold door and closed her eyes. "In 2 weeks, I will be here," she said to herself. "In 2 weeks, everything is going to change." A security guard watched her with curiosity from the inside. He was an older man, with a gray mustache and an impeccable uniform, who had seen thousands of people pass through those doors during his years of service. Something in the girl who remained motionless in front of the entrance moved him in a way he couldn't explain. He went out and approached her. "Are you all right, miss?" Alex opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you believe in justice?" The question took him completely by surprise. "Pardon?" "Do you believe that justice is real? The ground is a pretty word we use to make ugly things look better." The guard was silent for a moment, studying the serious face of that girl who spoke as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I think justice is like a plant," he finally replied. "Sometimes it seems dead, but if someone cares for it enough, it can grow again." Alex smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a genuine smile. That night, as she wrote in her salvaged notebook, Alex made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to try to impress anyone with complicated words or legal references she had memorized. She was going to do something much more dangerous. She was going to tell the truth. But like all truths that are worthwhile, this one would have to be torn from pain, polished by injustice, and presented with the courage of someone who has nothing to lose except the opportunity to be heard. Would it be enough to face a man who had turned the manipulation of truth into an art? Time would tell, but one thing was certain. Patrick Harding had never faced anyone like Alex Reyes. The Monday before the trial, the school was transformed into a hotbed of rumors and expectations. The news that a high school student would face the most famous district attorney in the country had reached the media, and now everyone wanted to know who that girl was who had had the audacity to challenge Patrick Harding. Alex arrived at school like any other day, carrying her burlap backpack and walking with that tranquility that she had learned to maintain, even when the world was falling apart around her. But something had changed. The hallways, which usually ignored her, were now filled with whispers and glances as she passed. "It's her," she heard someone say. "The one who's going to make a fool of herself on TV." "My mom says they're going to cancel the show out of pity," added another voice. But there were also different looks. Some teachers watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern, as if they were watching someone walking towards a precipice with their eyes open. The cafeteria workers smiled at her as she passed, and Mr. Esteban, the janitor, had patted her on the shoulder that morning, accompanied by a "good luck, kid." During recess, while Alex sat under her usual tree with a civil case book, someone unexpected approached her. It was Miranda, a girl from her same grade who came from a middle-class family. Not rich like some of her classmates, but not poor like Alex either. She was one of those people who floated in the social middle ground, neither popular nor marginalized. "Hi," Miranda said, sitting on the ground next to her without asking permission. Alex looked up, surprised. In the 3 years they had been sharing classes, Miranda had never spoken to her directly. "Hi," she replied cautiously. Miranda asked, but not with the mocking tone that Alex had learned to expect. There was something different in her voice, something akin to respect. "Yes." Miranda nodded slowly. "My dad says you're very brave. He says he wouldn't dare do something like that even if they paid him." Alex closed her book, marking the page with a piece of paper. "Does your dad know me?" "No, but he saw the news in the newspaper. You were on the front page of the City Gazette." Miranda took a folded newspaper from her backpack and showed it to her. Alex was breathless. There was her photograph, one they had taken without her realizing it, when she was leaving the library, next to a headline that said, "David versus Goliath. 13-year-old girl challenges the country's most powerful district attorney." The article was short, but precise. It described her economic situation without sensationalism, mentioned her father's sentence, spoke of her solitary preparation in the library. But what impacted her the most was the last line. "Alex Reyes represents the hope that justice can come from the most unexpected places." "Are you nervous?" Miranda asked, watching how Alex read and reread the article. "All the time," Alex admitted. "But I don't know how to explain it. Angry." "Angry at what?" Alex looked towards the school building, where you could see the windows of the classrooms where students like them learned about a world that seemed designed to exclude them. "At everything. At us having to be so extraordinary just to be heard. That a rich girl wouldn't have to study on the floor of her room because she doesn't have a desk. That my dad is in jail for something a rich person would have solved with a fine." Miranda nodded, although Alex doubted that she could really understand. But the gesture was genuine, and that meant something. "What are you going to say?" Miranda asked. "The truth," Alex replied without hesitation. "Just the truth." That afternoon, after class, Alex walked towards the library with slower steps than usual. The weight of public attention had begun to feel real, tangible. She was no longer just a girl studying in silence. She was now a symbol, a representation of something bigger than herself. Mrs. Carroll was waiting for her with a motherly smile and a cup of hot tea. "I saw the newspaper," she told her. "How are you feeling?" "Like they've put a costume on me that doesn't fit," Alex replied, accepting the cup with hands that were slightly trembling. "On Friday, you're not going to be a symbol," Mrs. Carroll told her, sitting in front of her. "You're going to be Alex, and that's more than enough." That night, while her grandmother slept and the house was plunged into familiar silence, Alex sat in front of her broken mirror. The same one where she had practiced her speech hundreds of times. But this time, she didn't practice words. She just looked at herself, trying to recognize the girl in the reflection. Her eyes were still the same large, dark, full of a determination she had inherited from generations of women who had survived the impossible. Her hair was still rebellious, resisting any attempt at domestication. Her hands were still small, but now they had calluses from writing so much, marks of honor she had earned in her silent battle against ignorance. "Who are you really?" she asked herself in the mirror. A poor girl who doesn't know her place, or someone who is about to find it. The mirror did not answer, but somewhere deep inside her, Alex felt that she already knew the answer. Friday would not only be a trial, it would be the moment when the world would have to decide if it was willing to listen to a voice that had never been taken seriously before. Thursday night, Alex's house felt different. Her grandmother, Mrs. Rosa, had been unusually silent during dinner. Tortillas with refried beans and a bit of cheese that she had gotten at a discount at the market. The deep wrinkles on her face seemed more pronounced under the yellow light of the bare bulb, and her hands, weathered by decades of hard work, trembled slightly as she served the plates. "Grandma," Alex said softly, "are you worried about tomorrow?" Mrs. Rosa stopped chewing and looked at her granddaughter with eyes that had seen too much suffering and too much injustice. "Not for you, honey. For them. For them. For them. For the people who are going to be watching." The old woman wiped her hands on her worn apron. "They're going to see a girl who looks like their daughters, their granddaughters themselves when they were young. They're going to see everything the world has told them they can't be." Alex felt a lump in her throat. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I disappoint them?" Mrs. Rosa got up from her chair and approached her granddaughter. Her hands, rough as sandpaper, but infinitely tender, took Alex's face between her palms. "Listen to me carefully, Alex Rosa Reyes," she said, using her full name as she only did in the most important moments. "You already won. The day you decided to raise your hand, the day you said I can. You already won. Everything that happens tomorrow is just, how do you say, the bonus." Alex smiled despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. "Bonus. Yes, that. The extra." Mrs. Rosa hugged her with the strength of someone who had raised 3 children and 5 grandchildren with nothing but love and an iron will. But the important thing already happened. You already showed the world that girls like us exist, that we think, that we are worth it. That night, Alex couldn't sleep, not from nerves, but from a strange energy that was running through her veins like electricity. She got out of bed and walked to the small window of her room, from where she could see the lights of the city extending towards the horizon. Somewhere in that smudge of lights was Patrick Harding, probably in a big house, with an office full of expensive books and framed diplomas. Perhaps he was reviewing strategies with a team of assistants, or perhaps he wasn't even thinking about the trial, because for him, it was just another day at work, another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. But Alex knew something that Patrick Harding didn't know. She had nothing to lose. He had a reputation to protect, an image to maintain, an ego to feed. She only had the truth, raw and unpolished, waiting to be released like a bird that had been caged too long. At dawn on Friday, Alex woke up before her grandmother. She took a cold shower because the water heater had been broken for months, and she got dressed in her best clothes. A navy blue dress that had been her mother's, adjusted with safety pins to fit better, and the only closed-toe shoes she had, that her grandmother had bought second-hand at the flea market, while she was having breakfast of watered-down coffee with milk and a sweet bread that Mrs. Rosa had saved since Sunday. An unexpected surprise arrived. Someone knocked on the rusty metal door that protected her house. It was Miranda, dressed in her school uniform but carrying a large bag. "What are you doing here?" Alex asked, genuinely surprised. "I came to accompany you," Miranda replied with a naturalness that admitted no discussion. From the bag she took out a navy blue blazer, clearly expensive, that matched Alex's dress perfectly. "It's from my older sister." It was the finest thing she had ever held in her hands. "I can't accept it. It's not a gift, it's a loan, between friends, The word friends floated in the air like a butterfly that neither of them dared to catch for fear of breaking it. Alex tried on the blazer. It fit her perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Thank you," she whispered. The trip to City Hall was surreal. Miranda had convinced her father to take them in his car, a sedan that felt like a limousine to Alex. As they crossed the city, she saw how the landscape changed. From the dusty streets and the blockhouses of her neighborhood, through middle-class neighborhoods with small but well-cared-for gardens, to the historic center where government buildings stood like monuments to power. City Hall was surrounded by news trucks, reporters with microphones, television cameras, and a crowd of onlookers that had gathered to witness the spectacle. Alex felt her stomach churn at the sight of so many people. "Ready?" Miranda asked, taking her hand. Alex took a deep breath. In a few hours, everything would be over. Either she would have shown that a poor girl could face the system and win, or she would have confirmed what many already thought, that people like her should be content with their place and not dream of changing anything. But as she climbed the marble stairs of City Hall, with the weight of the expectations of thousands of people like her on her shoulders, Alex knew that, no matter what happened, she would never again be the same invisible girl she had been until that morning. The moment of truth had arrived. Would the world be ready to hear what a 13-year-old girl had to say about justice? The courtroom was exactly as Alex had imagined it, in her most ambitious dreams and in her darkest nightmares. The dark woods shone with a polish that reflected the lights from the ceiling. The seats were upholstered in genuine leather that probably cost more than everything her family possessed, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of tradition. Power. Patrick Harding was already there when she entered, surrounded by a small army of assistants who were organizing documents in perfect piles and whispering last-minute strategies. The man looked exactly as he did on television, imposing, self-assured, dressed in a suit that screamed success from every fiber. His shoes shone so much that they looked like mirrors, and his Italian silk tie was knotted with the precision of someone who had never known hurry or desperation. When he saw Alex enter, Patrick allowed himself a condescending smile. He approached her with the calculated grace of a predator who was already savoring victory. "So you're the famous Alex," he said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I must admit I was expecting someone bigger." Alex shook his hand, noticing how it completely enveloped hers. "Size doesn't matter when you're right, Mr. Harding." Patrick chuckled softly, a sound that seemed more like a purr than an expression of genuine joy. "Right? Dear child, this isn't about being right. It's about winning. And to win you need experience, resources, a deep understanding of the system." He paused dramatically. "Things that, forgive my bluntness, you simply don't have." "You're right," Alex replied with a calmness that surprised even herself. "I don't have experience winning cases. I don't have resources or a team of assistants. I don't have diplomas hanging on the wall or shoes that cost more than the rent on my house." Patrick nodded, satisfied by his opponent's apparent surrender. "But," Alex continued, "I have something you lost a long time ago." "And what's that?" Patrick asked, raising an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. "Hunger," she replied simply. "Real hunger. Not just the hunger to win another case to add to your collection. Hunger for justice for people who have never tasted even a morsel of it." For the first time since they had started speaking, Patrick's smile wavered slightly. There was something in that girl's eyes, an intensity he hadn't expected, that didn't fit the image of an easy victim he had constructed in his mind. The judge, Honorable Judge Robert Salinas, entered the courtroom with the solemnity that his position required. He was an older man, with completely white hair and a face that had seen too many cases, too much injustice, too many inconvenient truths. He sat in his elevated place, observing the two opponents with eyes that did not reveal his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, addressing both those present in the courtroom and the cameras that were broadcasting live. "Today we are witnessing something unusual. A legal debate between District Attorney Patrick Harding and student Alex Reyes on a hypothetical case that, however, reflects very concrete realities of our justice system." He explained the rules. Each would have 20 minutes to present their case. Patrick would go first, as he had insisted, confident that his presentation would be so overwhelmingly superior that anything the girl said afterward would seem like the babbling of an amateur. The hypothetical case was perfect for someone like Patrick, a homeless woman accused of stealing food from a supermarket. The facts were clear, the evidence solid, the law unequivocal. From any traditional legal angle, it was a case impossible to defend. Patrick walked to the podium like a gladiator entering the Colosseum. His presentation was a symphony of legal technique, precedents cited with military precision, statistics deployed as weapons, arguments constructed with the perfect architecture of decades of experience. Members of the jury, he began with a voice that had been trained to project authority. You are before a case that may seem minor, but that actually touches the very foundations of our civilized society. If we allow need to excuse crime, if we let personal circumstances override the law, then what separates us from chaos? For 15 minutes, Patrick weaved a web of legal arguments that seemed impregnable. He cited cases from 1945, references to international treaties, sociological analyses of the impact of crime on communities. He spoke of the importance of social order, of the need to maintain clear boundaries between the legal and the illegal, of the dangerous precedents that would be established if empathy were allowed to cloud legal judgment. The defendant, he concluded, regardless of her circumstances, committed a crime. She took property that did not belong to her. The law is clear, the evidence is irrefutable, and it is our duty as a society to enforce that law without exception. Any other decision would be a betrayal of the principles that govern us. The applause was automatic, polite, the kind of recognition given to a technically perfect performance. Patrick returned to his table with the satisfaction of someone who has just executed a masterpiece. Now it was Alex's turn. She walked to the podium with steps that seemed larger than her legs should allow. The microphone was adjusted for Patrick's height, so she had to stretch to reach it. The gesture, far from looking awkward, became a powerful symbol. A little girl rising to make her voice heard in a world designed to silence her. She had no notes, she had no statistics, she had no memorized legal precedents, she only had her truth. Members of the jury, she began, and her voice, though small, cut through the air with a clarity that surprised everyone. Mr. Harding is right about many things. The law is clear. The facts are obvious. And yes, technically, a crime was committed. Patrick smiled, thinking that the girl was conceding victory before she had even really begun her defense. But, Alex continued, and that little word fell like a stone into a silent pond, I want to tell you about a night when I was 8 years old. And then, something extraordinary began to happen. Alex didn't argue. She told a story. She didn't cite laws. She shared life. She didn't recite precedents. She offered humanity in its purest and most devastating form. It was December, Alex continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. And it was colder than any December I could remember. My little brother, Peter, had been coughing for days, but we didn't have the money to take him to the doctor. My mom had lost her job cleaning offices because she got sick, and my dad. She paused, taking a deep breath. My dad was already in jail. The silence in the room was so profound that you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Some members of the jury leaned forward, like plants seeking the sun. That night, Peter got worse. He had a fever, and his breathing sounded like something was broken inside. My mom put on her oldest coat, the only one she had, and went out to find medicine. She returned 2 hours later with cough syrup and some food. Alex looked directly at Patrick, who had stopped smiling. Later, I learned that she had taken that medicine from a pharmacy, just like the woman in our case took food from the supermarket. Technically, my mother committed a crime that night. The breath of some people in the audience had become audible. A reporter in the front row had tears in her eyes, although she continued to take notes. Do you know what happened next? Alex asked, her voice now charged with an emotion that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Peter got better. The fever went down. The cough subsided. And in the morning he was already trying to get out of bed. My mother had saved her son. She paused, letting the words settle like seeds in fertile ground. Mr. Harding wants us to talk about precedents and statistics. He wants us to see the homeless woman as a criminal who threatens social order. But I see my mother that December night. I see a woman who chose love over the law, survival over convention, humanity over the rules. Patrick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was not what he had expected. There were no legal arguments to refute, no technicalities to dismantle. It was pure human emotion, and he had no tools to combat that. Do you know what the difference is between my mother and that homeless woman? Alex continued. None. They are both mothers. They were both desperate. They both faced an impossible choice: obey a law that doesn't protect them, or protect those they love. She moved closer to the microphone, and for a moment it seemed she had grown several inches. Mr. Harding says we must maintain social order. But what kind of order is that allows children to starve while supermarkets throw away tons of food every day? What kind of justice is that punishes the desperate while protecting those who created that desperation? A murmur ran through the room like a wave. The judge had to bang his gavel to restore silence, but even he seemed moved by the girl's words. I'm not saying that stealing is okay, Alex clarified, anticipating the objection she knew was coming. I'm saying that when a society fails so completely to protect its most vulnerable members, when the legal system becomes a tool to perpetuate injustice instead of combating it, then maybe the problem isn't the desperate people who break the rules. Maybe the problem is the rules themselves. Patrick stood up, ready to object, but something in the judge's gaze stopped him. Judge Salinas had seen many cases in his career, had heard thousands of arguments, but something in that girl's words resonated with a truth he hadn't heard in his courtroom for a long time. My mother died last year, Alex said, and her voice broke slightly for the first time. She died because we couldn't afford the treatment she needed. She died in the waiting room of a public hospital, waiting for someone to have time to attend to her. She died being a criminal, technically, because she had stolen medicine to save her son. Tears ran freely down the cheeks of several members of the jury. One of them, an older man who worked as a plumber, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand without any shame. But she also died being a heroine, Alex continued, her voice regaining strength. She died being a mother who did what she had to do to protect her children. She died being human in a world that sometimes forgets what that means. She addressed the jury directly, establishing eye contact with each of them. You have the power to decide if that homeless woman is a criminal or a victim of a system that failed before she had to make that desperate decision. You have the power to send a message about what kind of society we want to be. The room was in complete silence. Even the cameraman had stopped moving, captured by the intensity of the moment. Do we want to be a society that punishes desperation? Alex asked. Or do we want to be a society that wonders why that desperation exists in the first place? Do we want laws that protect property above people? Or do we want justice that recognizes that sometimes people matter more than the rules? She returned to the central podium, and for a moment she remained silent, letting her words resonate in the heart of each person present. Mr. Harding can cite all the laws he wants, she concluded. He can talk about precedents and social order, but at the end of the day you have to decide if you are going to sleep tonight, knowing that you punished a woman for the crime of wanting to feed her family, or knowing that you sent the message that compassion and humanity still have a place in our justice system. When she finished speaking and returned to her table, the silence extended for several seconds that seemed eternal. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was not the polite and technical applause that Patrick had received. It was something deeper, more visceral, more real. Patrick Harding, for the first time in his career, was completely speechless. He had arrived prepared for a legal debate, but he found himself facing something much more powerful. Human truth in its purest and most devastating form. Have you ever had to choose between doing what is legal and doing what is right? Share your experience in the comments. The minutes that followed were the longest in the history of that courtroom. The jury withdrew to deliberate, but their absence did not bring the usual relief that accompanies recesses. Instead, the room was plunged into a heavy silence, charged with the words that Alex had released like birds, that could not be returned to their cage. Patrick Harding remained seated at his table, but for the first time in decades, he was not reviewing documents or whispering strategies with his assistants. His hands, which always moved with purpose and precision, rested motionless on the polished surface of the table. His gaze had been lost in some undefined point in space, as if he were seeing something that the rest of the world could not perceive. Alex, for her part, had sat with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the morning. But Miranda, who was watching her from the public gallery, could see the small signs of tension. The way her fingers intertwined and separated repeatedly, how her eyes moved towards the door where the jury had left. The slow and deliberate breathing of someone who is trying to remain calm. In the gallery, the reporters whispered among themselves with unusual intensity. Some furiously typed on their phones, sending real-time updates on what was being called on social media as the speech that changed everything. Others simply remained seated, processing what they had witnessed, trying to find words to describe something that transcended usual journalism. Mrs. Carroll, who had closed the library to come and support Alex, discreetly wiped her tears with a frayed handkerchief. Next to her, the security guard who had spoken with Alex weeks earlier seemed to have aged years in the last 30 minutes. His eyes, which had seen thousands of people enter and leave that building, now looked at the girl with something akin to reverence. At the defense table, or what would have been the defense table in a real case, Alex closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't praying exactly, but there was something spiritual in the way she seemed to be gathering strength from a place deep within herself. She thought of her mother, of the nights when she had seen her silently crying after believing that her children were asleep. She thought of her father, alone in a cell for a crime he had committed out of love. She thought of her grandmother, who that morning had given her a hug that seemed to contain all the accumulated hope of generations of women who had struggled in silence. "How are you feeling?" asked in a low voice the lawyer who had been officially assigned to assist her, a young man named Mr. Martinez, who had been observing everything with expressions that ranged from surprise to admiration. "As if I'd been saving those words all my life," Alex replied without opening her eyes, "and finally found the right place to release them." Patrick Harding listened to her. He hadn't been able to avoid it. His ears seemed tuned to every sound she made, as if his brain was desperately trying to understand what had happened. In 40 years of career, he had faced the best lawyers in the country. He had won cases that seemed impossible, had turned sure defeats into crushing victories, had manipulated juries with the skill of a master puppeteer. But never, not once, had he been silenced the way that girl had silenced him. Not with superior legal arguments or more convincing evidence, but with something much more fundamental. With human truth exposed without filters, without manipulation, without any agenda beyond the simple act of being heard. He found himself remembering why he had originally decided to study law. It hadn't been for power or prestige or money, although all of those had eventually come. It had been because, at 18, he had genuinely believed that the law could be a tool to do good in the world. When had he lost that belief? When had he begun to see justice as a game to be won, instead of an ideal to be pursued? His assistants watched him with concern. They had never seen him so still, so silent after a legal confrontation. Usually, Patrick analyzed every moment of the process, discussed strategies for possible appeals, celebrated the strong points of his presentation. But now he seemed to be in another world completely. "Mr. Harding," whispered his chief assistant, an efficient woman named Ms. Torres, "are you all right?" Patrick looked at her as if he didn't recognize her for a moment. "Do you have children, Carmen?" The question took her by surprise. In all the years she had worked for him, Patrick had never asked a personal question. "Yes, sir. 2. Have you ever had to?" he began, but he didn't finish the question. Instead, he turned his gaze towards Alex, who remained seated with a dignity that seemed too great for her small body. In the gallery, the reactions were as varied as the people present. Some of the usual courtroom attendees, lawyers, officials, specialized journalists seemed to be reevaluating everything they believed they knew about the legal system. Others, especially those who had come out of curiosity rather than professional interest, wiped their eyes and whispered comments about how that girl had said what everyone had been thinking, but had never dared to express. A group of law students from the local university, who had come as part of an academic excursion, were having a heated discussion in whispers about the implications of what they had witnessed. For them, who had been studying cases and precedents for months, Alex's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. "She didn't use a single legal citation," murmured one of them. No precedents, no statutes, no jurisprudence, just humanity. Exactly, replied another student. And that's why it was so powerful. She didn't address the brain, she addressed the heart. Meanwhile, in the deliberation room, the jury faced a decision that transcended the written laws. Technically, the case was clear. A crime had been committed. There was evidence. The laws were unequivocal. But Alex's words had introduced a dimension that none of them had expected to face. It was more than an academic exercise now. It was a fundamental question about what kind of society they wanted to be, what kind of justice they wanted to support, what kind of precedent they wanted to establish not only legally, but moral. The clock on the wall advanced with a slowness that seemed to mock time itself. Every minute that passed increased the tension in the room, but also deepened the reflection that Alex's words had provoked in each person present. After 45 minutes that felt like hours, the door to the deliberation room opened. The jury returned with expressions that revealed nothing, but there was something different in the way they walked, as if they were carrying a weight they hadn't had when they left. Judge Salinas took his place with the solemnity that the moment required. His eyes, which had seen thousands of cases resolved during his career, now reflected something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine uncertainty about what he was about to witness. Has the jury reached a decision? He asked, following a protocol he had recited countless times. The jury foreman, a retired school teacher named Mr. Vega, stood up with movements that seemed to take some of his vital energy. In his hands, he held a paper that had been folded and unfolded several times during the deliberation. Yes, Your Honor, we have reached a decision. Alex stood up, feeling her legs tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment she had been waiting for weeks. Miranda, from the gallery, sent her a smile of support that Alex could feel, even though she wasn't looking directly at her. Patrick also stood up, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what he expected to hear. Part of him wanted to win, of course. It was an instinct so deep that it had defined his professional identity for decades. But another part, a part that had remained dormant for years, almost hoped to lose. In the case of the people versus the homeless woman accused of theft, began the Mr. Vega, his voice charged with an emotion he was trying to contain. We find the defendant. The silence stretched for several seconds. Some reporters leaned forward, others held their breath. Not guilty by reason of extreme need and systemic failure. The roar that followed was unlike anything that courtroom had ever witnessed. It wasn't just applause. It was pure emotional release. People who didn't even know each other were hugging, crying, laughing. The camera flashes fired like strobe lights. But for once, the media attention felt justified instead of invasive. Alex stood still for a moment, processing what she had just heard. Then slowly, a smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of personal triumph, but of profound validation, as if the world had finally confirmed something she had known in her heart all her life. Patrick Harding remained standing, but something fundamental had changed in his posture. The shoulders that he had always kept square now seemed to carry a different weight. He approached Alex with steps that were slower, more deliberate than any movement he had made in that room. Alex, he said when he reached her side, and his voice had a quality that he had never used before in public. Can I speak with you in private? She nodded, and both of them headed towards a small office adjacent to the courtroom. The reporters wanted to follow them, but Judge Salinas established a perimeter of respect that no one dared to cross. In the privacy of that office, surrounded only by legal books that seemed like silent witnesses to history, Patrick did something he hadn't done in decades. He admitted that he was wrong. For 40 years, he said to Alex, sitting in a chair that put him at eye level with her, I've believed that the law was an instrument of order, that justice meant enforcing the rules without exception. That experience and technical knowledge were the only things that mattered in a courtroom. He paused, looking at his hands that had signed hundreds of legal documents, that had gestured during thousands of arguments. But today you taught me something I had forgotten. You reminded me that before laws exist, before courtrooms exist, before lawyers exist, there is something more fundamental. And that when laws serve to protect inhumanity instead of combating it, then maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe the problem is the laws. Alex listened in silence, watching this powerful man transform before her eyes into something more vulnerable, more real. "What are you going to do now?" she asked him. Patrick smiled. And for the first time, it was a genuine smile, without calculation, without an agenda. "I'm going to keep my promise. I'm going to give you the $1 million. But more than that." He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the government building across the street. "I'm going to change the way I practice law. I'm going to remember that every case I touch affects real human beings, not just files." He turned to her. "And I'm going to make sure that you have all the opportunities you need to become the lawyer this country needs. Because after today, I'm sure that's what you're going to be." But what moved Alex most was not his words, but something she saw in his eyes. Respect. Genuine respect from someone who had dedicated his entire life to a specific field towards someone who had just shown him a dimension of that field he had never considered. Will this be the moment that changes everything for Alex and for the justice system itself? The outcome will surprise you. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of changes that no one, not even Alex, had anticipated. The news had spread beyond the borders of the United States, becoming an international symbol of how one person's voice can challenge entire systems when armed with truth and determination. The Bar Association convened special sessions to discuss the implications of the case. Law schools began to include the Reyes speech in their study programs as an example of argumentation based on humanitarian principles. International human rights organizations cited Alex's words in their reports on social justice. But the most significant changes were occurring in places that were less visible but more fundamental. Patrick Harding had kept his word in ways that surprised even his closest collaborators. The $1 million had been delivered, but accompanied by something more valuable. He had established a foundation dedicated to providing free legal representation for families in extreme poverty. "It can't be that access to justice depends on the size of the wallet," he had declared at a press conference that shocked the American legal world. "If we truly believe in the rule of law, then that right must be available to everyone." The foundation had started with small cases, people facing unfair evictions, families fighting for access to medical services, workers who had been fired without just cause. But each case was handled with the same principle that Alex had demonstrated, that behind every legal file is a human life that deserves dignity and respect. Alex herself had become something she had never sought to be, a public figure. She received invitations to speak at conferences. Universities wanted to offer her full scholarships. The media sought her for interviews. But she had navigated this new reality with the same instinctive wisdom she had shown in court. She accepted the opportunities that allowed her to continue speaking about social justice, but rejected those that turned her into a spectacle. She gave interviews when she could use the platform to talk about the people who were still facing the same injustices she had described, but avoided appearances that focused on her as an individual. "It's not about me," she had told a particularly insistent reporter. "It's about the thousands of people who will never have the opportunity to stand in front of a microphone and tell their story. I was just lucky enough to be able to speak for them." Her school had also changed. The teachers who had once looked at her with pity now looked at her with a respect that sometimes made her uncomfortable. Her classmates, who had been cruel in their taunts, now oscillated between genuine admiration and the confused resentment of those who realized they had been wrong about someone. But the most significant change was more subtle and more profound. In her neighborhood, in the families who had watched the trial on television, in the conversations of the people who cleaned offices and sold food on the street corners, something had begun to grow that had been absent for too long. The belief that their voices mattered. Mrs. Maria, the neighbor who worked in the early morning, had begun to organize weekly meetings where the mothers of the neighborhood discussed common problems. "If a 13-year-old girl can get them to listen," she had said, "then we can also talk about what we need." Don Furman had stopped apologizing for selling sweets on the subway and had begun to talk to other vendors about their rights. The security guard at City Hall had begun to treat the people who entered the building with a courtesy that went beyond protocol, especially those who were obviously intimidated by the grandeur of the place. The systemic changes were slower, but equally real. Several congressmen had begun to propose reforms to the laws on petty crimes related to poverty. Civil organizations had found new energy to press for changes in the justice system. Law schools were reevaluating their pedagogical approaches to include more emphasis on social justice and less on legal manipulation techniques. Alex continued to study. But now, with resources she had never dreamed of having, her new house purchased with part of the prize money, but in the same neighborhood where she had grown up, had a small but well-equipped library. There was a desk, adequate light, and internet access that allowed her to research cases and precedents with a depth that had previously been impossible. But most importantly, she wasn't studying alone. Patrick's Foundation had established a mentoring program where students from low-income families could learn directly from experienced lawyers. Alex was the first beneficiary, but the program already had a waiting list of hundreds of young people who had seen in her a model of what was possible. One afternoon, while reviewing cases for one of her mentoring projects, she received an unexpected call. It was from the office of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. "Miss Reyes," said the formal voice on the other end of the line, "the Chief Justice would like to extend an invitation for you to participate in a special commission on justice system reform. Your perspective would be invaluable to our work." Alex remained silent for several seconds, processing the magnitude of what she was being offered. A girl who months before had been invisible to the system was now being invited to help reform it. "Can I ask you something?" she finally said to the person on the phone. "Of course. Is this invitation because they think I have something important to contribute, or because they think my participation would look good in the photographs?" The brutal honesty of the question seemed to surprise her interlocutor. "After reading the transcripts of your participation in the trial, Ms. Reyes, I can assure you that your perspective is exactly what we need to create real change." Alex smiled. "Then, I accept." "What is it?" "That part of the Commission's work include visits to the communities most affected by the current system. We can't reform something we don't fully understand." "That can be arranged." When she hung up the phone, Alex sat at her new desk, looking out the window at the street where she had grown up. Children played in the same dusty streets. Mothers hung clothes on the same improvised clotheslines. Men returned from work with the same tiredness on their shoulders. But there was something different in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before, as if the world had turned slightly on its axis, opening up spaces that had previously been closed. 6 months after the trial that had changed her life, Alex faced the biggest challenge of her new reality. The Justice Reform Commission had worked for months, visiting communities, interviewing families, documenting the systematic failures that allowed poverty to become an automatic sentence of guilt. But now they had to present their recommendations before the National Congress, and Alex knew that this time she would not be facing a single arrogant man, but an entire system that had centuries of inertia behind it. The night before the presentation, she met with Patrick Harding in his office. The man who had been her opponent had become her most important mentor, but also someone who understood the magnitude of what they were trying to achieve. "Nervous?" he asked, watching her review once more the statistics she had memorized. "Terrified," Alex admitted. "It's one thing to convince 12 people in a mock trial. It's another thing entirely to try to change laws that have existed for decades." Patrick leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman who had grown so much in so little time, but who still retained that intensity that had made her so powerful in the courtroom. "Do you know what the difference is between a good lawyer and an extraordinary one?" he asked. Alex shook her head. "A good lawyer knows the laws. An extraordinary one understands why those laws exist, who they really work for, and when they need to change." He smiled. "You jumped straight to extraordinary." The next day, the congressional chamber was packed to the brim. Congressmen, senators, representatives of civil organizations, national and international journalists, and in the public gallery, hundreds of people who had traveled from different parts of the country to witness what many considered a historic moment. Alex entered wearing a sober but dignified suit, carrying a briefcase that contained not only statistics and legal proposals, but also photographs and testimonies of the families she had met during the months of investigation. The chairman of the Congressional Justice Committee, an older man named Congressman Vargas, who had been in power for over 20 years, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Reyes," he said with the condescending tone that veteran politicians use with young idealists, "we understand that you have some interesting ideas about judicial reform. Alex looked at him directly. They are ideas, Congressman Vargas. They are urgent needs backed by systematic evidence. The comment caused a murmur in the room. The congressmen weren't used to being corrected so directly, especially by someone who was technically still a minor. Very well, replied Congressman Vargas, regaining his composure. Present your urgent needs. Alex walked to the central podium, and for a moment the déjà vu was overwhelming. It was the same feeling of being small in front of a microphone, designed for bigger voices. The same feeling of carrying the weight of voices that couldn't speak for themselves. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't alone. In the public gallery, she could see Mrs. Carroll, who had closed the library again to be there. There was Miranda, who had now become one of her best friends and collaborators. There was the security guard from City Hall, who had used his days off to make the trip. There were the mothers of her neighborhood, dressed in their best clothes, with expressions of pride and hope that gave more strength than any legal argument. And in the front row, in the section reserved for special guests, was Patrick Harding, who looked at her with the confidence of someone who knows they are about to witness something extraordinary. Honorable congressmen and senators, Alex began, her voice clear and firm. I come before you not as an expert in law, but as a witness to what happens when those laws fail the people who need them most. For the next 30 minutes, Alex presented an analysis of the American justice system that was simultaneously technical and deeply human. She presented statistics on the correlation between poverty and incarceration, but she accompanied them with names and faces of real people. She spoke about necessary reforms in the penal code, but explained each one in terms of how it would affect the lives of specific families she had met. The central proposal, she said, reaching the heart of her presentation, is the creation of specialized courts in restorative justice for petty crimes related to economic need. Instead of punishing desperation, these courts would work to address the causes that led to that desperation. An opposition congressman raised his hand. Ms. Reyes, don't you think this could create a dangerous precedent? That it could be interpreted as a license to steal? Alex looked at him with a calmness that impressed even the most experienced journalists. Congressman Hernandez, do you have children? The question took him by surprise. Yes, 2. If one of your children was dying and you didn't have money for medicine, what would you do? The silence that followed was deafening. The congressman opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. Exactly, Alex continued. Paternal love doesn't consult penal codes. Human desperation doesn't stop at the laws. We can continue to criminalize poverty, or where we can start to humanize it. The phrase resonated in the room like a bell. Some congressmen nodded. Others took notes furiously. Others simply looked at her with expressions that oscillated between respect and amazement. When she finished her presentation, the applause was immediate and prolonged. But Alex knew that applause in politics doesn't always translate into votes. And votes don't always translate into real change. The real moment of tension would come during the question period, when the congressman who opposed the reforms would try to dismantle her arguments, question her experience, or simply wear down her credibility until the public lost interest. What they didn't know was that Alex had spent months preparing not only to argue in favor of justice, but to defend it against all the attacks that might be launched against her. And this time, she had more than words. She had evidence, she had allies, and she had the strength that comes from knowing that you are fighting not for yourself, but for all the people who will never have the opportunity to be where you are. The real battle was about to begin. The question period extended for more than 2 hours, becoming one of the most intense and watched debates in recent congressional history. Congressman after congressman stood up with questions that were more political statements than genuine searches for information. But Alex responded to each one with a combination of precise data and unwavering humanity that disarmed even the most hostile. Congressman Morales, known for his conservative rhetoric, attempted a particularly aggressive attack. Ms. Reyes, don't you think your proposal is fundamentally unfair to the victims of these crimes? Why should an honest merchant suffer losses because someone decided to steal instead of seeking legal help? Alex nodded, recognizing the validity of the concern. Congressman Morales, you are right that the victims deserve protection and compensation. That's why our proposal includes a restitution fund financed by the state and mediation programs between victims and offenders. The goal is not to ignore the harm caused, but to repair it in a way that strengthens the community instead of fragmenting it further. And who is going to pay for that fund? The congressman insisted. The honest taxpayers? All of us, Alex replied without hesitation, because all of us are responsible when we allow extreme poverty to exist in a society that has the resources to eliminate it. The cost of keeping someone in prison for a year is 3 times greater than the cost of providing them with education, medical care, and employment opportunities. We are not talking about additional expenses. We are talking about a smarter investment of resources that we are already spending. The hours passed, and gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The hostile questions became curious. The personal attacks were transformed into requests for technical clarification. Even the congressman who had come determined to oppose any reform began to ask questions that suggested a genuine openness to considering changes. Congresswoman Sanchez, a center-leaning legislator known for her pragmatism, posed the question that many had been thinking but hadn't dared to ask. Ms. Reyes, you have presented compelling arguments and detailed proposals, but let's be realistic. How can a person of your age, without experience in the functioning of government or the implementation of public policies, be so sure that these reforms will work in practice? It was the question that Alex had been waiting for, the one that went to the heart of all the doubts that the legislators had about taking the proposals of someone so young seriously. Congresswoman Sanchez, Alex responded, you're right that I don't have experience implementing policies. But I have something different. Experience living the consequences of the policies that you have implemented. She directed herself directly to the congresswoman, but her voice was projected to reach every corner of the room. You can study statistics on poverty. I have felt real hunger. You can read reports about failures in the justice system. I have seen my father go to prison for a crime that was born of desperation. You can theorize about the impact of lack of access to health services. I have seen my mother die because we couldn't afford her treatment. The words fell into a silence so deep that you could hear the collective breathing of hundreds of people. I'm not here because I'm an expert in government, she continued. I'm here because I'm an expert in being governed. And after 13 years of that experience, I can tell you with absolute certainty that the current system doesn't work for millions of Americans who deserve something better. She paused, looking directly at each congressman she could see. Policies are not theoretical abstractions. They are decisions that affect real lives. And if you want to create policies that really work, maybe you should listen more to the people who live those lives and less to the consultants who only study them from a distance. The applause that followed didn't come only from the public gallery. Several congressmen joined in, some with expressions that suggested they had just understood something fundamental that they had overlooked during years of political career. The chairman of the committee called for a 30-minute recess so that the congressmen could consult among themselves. During that time, Alex was surrounded by journalists, legislators, and representatives of civil organizations who wanted to know more details about the proposals. But the most significant conversation occurred when Congressman Vargas, the same one who had received her with condescension hours before, approached her with a completely different expression. Ms. Reyes, he said, I've been in this Congress for 20 years. I've listened to thousands of presentations. I've voted on hundreds of laws. I've participated in countless debates about justice and social policy. He paused, as if he was carefully choosing his next words. But I had never heard someone explain so clearly why what we do here really matters. And I had never felt so ashamed of how little I knew about the lives of the people that our laws affect. He extended his hand. If these proposals come to a vote, they will have my support, and I will make sure that they have the support of enough colleagues to become law. When the session resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of a confrontation between opposing ideologies, it had become a collaboration to refine proposals that most of those present now saw as necessary and viable. At the end of the day, the Justice Committee voted unanimously to send the reform proposals to the full Congress with a recommendation of urgent approval. It was more than Alex had dreamed of hoping for, and it meant that her work of the last few months had a real chance of becoming law. But as she left the congressional building, surrounded by journalists and congratulations, Alex knew that the true measure of success would not be the approval of the laws, but how those laws would change the lives of people like the ones she had met. In her investigation, the real work was just beginning. A year after the day that had changed her life forever, Alex found herself again in a courtroom. But this time, it wasn't as an accused or a defender, but as an observer of the first case tried under the new restorative justice laws that she had helped create. The woman in the dock looked so much like her mother that Alex felt a lump in her throat. Maria Elena Gutierrez, 34 years old, had been arrested for stealing baby formula from a pharmacy. Her 6-month-old son had been crying from hunger for 2 days, and she had lost her cleaning job when the building where she worked was sold and demolished. Under the old system, Maria Elena would have faced up to 3 years in prison, separating her from her children and perpetuating the cycle of poverty that had led to the original crime. Under the new system, she was before a restorative justice court where the goal was to repair the damage and address the causes of the problem. The judge, trained specifically in the new protocols, addressed Maria Elena with a dignity that she clearly had not expected. "Ms. Gutierrez, we understand that the circumstances that led you to be here today are complex. Could you tell us in your own words what happened?" In a trembling voice, Maria Elena told her story. The sudden dismissal, the exhausted savings, the rejected job applications, the nights listening to her baby crying from hunger while she tried to decide whether to use the last few dollars for food or for the transportation she needed to look for a job. "It wasn't an easy decision," she said, looking at the floor. "I knew it was wrong, but my baby was hungry, and I had exhausted all other options." The representative of the pharmacy, an older man named Mr. Rodriguez, had been prepared by mediators to understand the full context of the case. Instead of demanding punishment, he spoke about his own experience as a father and his understanding of the desperation that had led Maria Elena to his store. "My wife and I decided not to press charges," he announced, "but we want to make sure this doesn't happen again, neither for Ms. Gutierrez nor for other mothers in similar situations." The process that followed was revolutionary in its simplicity and humanity. Instead of a prison sentence, Maria Elena received immediate access to a food assistance program for her family, enrollment in a job training program with guaranteed placement, subsidized daycare support so she could work, family mediation services to help her establish a support network, the opportunity to perform community service teaching other mothers about available resources. 3 months later, Maria Elena had a stable job as a nursing assistant. Her children were healthy and well-fed, and she had become an active volunteer in the program that had helped her. Alex watched all this from the gallery, accompanied by Patrick Harding, who now divided his time between his traditional legal practice and the pro bono work he did through his foundation. How do you feel watching this?" he asked in a low voice. "Like I'm witnessing the birth of something that always should have existed," Alex replied. "It's real justice, not just punishment disguised as justice." After the proceedings, they left the courthouse together. Outside, Alex was approached by a young reporter who had been following the implementation of the new laws. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "now that the reforms are working, what are your plans? College? Politics? Law?" Alex smiled, but it was a different smile than any she had shown before. It was the smile of someone who had found not only her voice, but her purpose. "I'm going to study law, yes," she replied. "But not to become the kind of lawyer who manipulates the system. I want to be the kind of lawyer who helps create better systems." She paused, looking towards the courthouse where she had just witnessed justice functioning as it should. "And I want to make sure that more kids like me have the opportunity to be heard before they have to scream to be noticed." That night, Alex returned to her home in the same neighborhood where she had grown up. She had been able to buy a better house in a different neighborhood, but she had chosen to stay. Her new house was modest but dignified, with a library that she had converted into a study center for neighborhood children who needed help with their homework or simply a quiet place to read. Her grandmother, Mrs. Rosa, was waiting for her in the kitchen with a cup of hot coffee and that smile that had been her anchor during the most difficult moments. "How was the courthouse today, honey?" "Hopeful, Grandma. Very hopeful." Mrs. Rosa nodded, as if she had known from the beginning that things would end exactly as they had ended. "Your mother would be so proud." "Do you think so?" "I'm sure. She always said that you were going to change the world. I told her not to exaggerate, that you were just a kid." The old woman laughed softly. Turns out she was right. Alex approached the kitchen window, from where she could see the lights of the city extending towards the horizon. There was so much work to do still, so many voices that needed to be amplified, So many injustices that required attention. So many systems that needed reform. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems. She felt energized by the possibility of the solutions. She had learned something fundamental on her journey from that night, when she decided to participate in the contest. That real change doesn't come from the institutions downwards, but from the people upwards. A week later, she received a call that surprised even her. It was from the National University, offering her not only a full scholarship to study law, but also the opportunity to create a pilot program where high school students from marginalized communities could take introductory classes in law and social justice. The idea, the rector explained to her on the phone, is to create a pipeline of students who come to the university not only with academic knowledge, but with a real understanding of how the law affects communities. We want you to lead this program. Alex accepted immediately, but with her own conditions, that the program would take place in the communities themselves, not just on the university campus, that it would include regular visits to courts and government offices, and that each student would complete a final project that proposed real solutions to problems identified in their own community. The program became a model that was replicated in universities across the country. The students who went through it came to careers in law, politics, and social service with a perspective that their professors had never seen. The perspective of those who had lived the failures of the system, but had also learned to imagine how it could be better. 5 years after the day that had changed everything, Alex graduated from law school with honors, but more importantly, with a portfolio of cases that had established important precedents for the protection of the rights of families in poverty. Her graduation speech was simple, but powerful. Education doesn't make us better than others. It makes us more responsible towards others. Patrick Harding, who had been invited as the keynote speaker, but had insisted that Alex occupy that place, watched her from the audience with the satisfaction of a teacher who has seen his student exceed all expectations. After the ceremony, he approached her with a smile that had completely lost the arrogance that had once defined it. "Do you know what's most extraordinary about all this?" he said. "What? That a 13-year-old girl taught me more about justice in 20 minutes than I had learned in 40 years of career." Alex hugged him, and in that hug were years of mentoring, of collaboration, of working together to create a more just system. "And an arrogant district attorney taught me that people can change, no matter how long they've been doing things the wrong way." That night, at an intimate dinner with her grandmother, Miranda, Mrs. Carroll, and some of the neighbors who had been with her from the beginning, Alex reflected on the journey that had taken her from an invisible girl in a marginalized neighborhood to a lawyer who had helped change the laws of her country. "What's the next step?" Miranda asked, who was now studying journalism and had documented many of the cases that had arisen from the new laws. Alex smiled. That smile that now bore the wisdom of someone who had learned that real changes require patience, persistence, and above all, the willingness to never stop listening to those who most need to be heard. "The next step," she said, "is to make sure that no child has to wait until they are 13 to discover that their voice matters. It is to create a world where justice is not a privilege to be earned, but a right that we all have from the moment we are born." And as the city lights flickered beyond the windows, everyone at that small but loving table knew that Alex Reyes wasn't making a vain promise. It was a declaration of war against injustice, pronounced by someone who had already demonstrated that the most important battles can be won with truth, determination, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves dignity. The world had changed because a girl had dared to believe she could change it. And now, that same girl, turned into a woman, was preparing to help others discover their own power to transform what seemed impossible to change. Because in the end, justice isn't something that is granted from above, it's something that is built from below. One voice, one story, one truth at a time. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so I know you stayed with me until the end. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.